I kid you not, as I just plonked this book down to a minute, it just literally just went phoop, to roundabout the very passage I wanted to read. Just had to turn at least 2 pages. That way, incredible illustration, by the way. Right, so yes, this is the passage I want to read. It was Sam's first view of a battle of men against men, and he did not like it much. He was glad that he could not see the dead face. He wondered what the man's name was, and where he came from, and if he really was evil at heart, or what lies or threats had led him on the long march from his home, and if he would not really rather have stayed there in peace. That passage right there, as well as other implications of the lore, if you're paying attention, should disprove this ridiculous claim that Tolkien is racist. A claim that can only come from the mouths of people who don't even bother doing their research. Not with the source material, not with the scholars, nope, just assumptions based on fads of the modern day. Let's debunk the fad, shall we? Another year, another time of ridiculous accusations against J.R.R. Tolkien, one of the most renowned fantasy authors of all time. I can guarantee you from experience, closer examination to Tolkien, his letters, his personal letters, I guarantee you a close examination of Tolkien's writings, his intentions, his personal letters, and from what else we understand of how he related to his friends and family, all that should paint a much clearer picture coming from that source material itself rather than the politically driven assumptions of people who want to push something rather than teach the truth. I wanted to bring up this topic because, unfortunately, there seems to be this trend going on right now that there's this silly university course that seems fixated on claiming that Tolkien is racist, even though delving close into the source material proves otherwise. So let's go over the accusations one by one and then debunk them one by one. Firstly, whilst we're still on the topic of the matter, there's the accusations about Tolkien being some kind of supremacist against Eastern cultures. But see, I deliberately began this video by reading a passage from The Two Towers that debunks that very claim. Far from being some propagandist supremacist against the Easterns that the woke claim that Tolkien is. On the contrary, Tolkien is very sympathetic to the Eastern men who have been tricked by Sauron just like people in the West. See, if you're paying attention to the lore, there's also the fact that the Númenóreans have also fallen victim to Sauron's corruption, just as much as these Eastern men have. All men, West and East, are all equal in the eyes of Eru Ilúvatar, but Sauron comes along and corrupts them. Tolkien himself even said, evil is not really a thing, it's more of a distortion of what good already exists. So next time someone comes along and claims, Tolkien was against Eastern people, remember that if you're following the lore consistently, you realize that both men in the West and the East have fallen victim to Sauron's corruption, including the Old Kings who became the Nazgûl, the Númenóreans, several characters who have been tempted by the One Ring, shall we keep that in mind. There's also Denethor, who we all know is an absolute tomato slurping jerk, as well as the Eastern men who have fallen corruption to Sauron's corruption. So no, Tolkien was not against Eastern cultures. Alright, so the next accusation is, oh, orcs represent a suppressed minority! This accusation makes this completely absurd assumption that orcs somehow represent Africans. But if you're following Tolkien's lore consistently, that's not how the orcs work. Orcs are not a biological race in the same way that humans are. They are distorted elves and men. Let me play you a sample from the Fellowship of the Ring movie.
Do you know how the Orcs first came into being? They were elves once, taken by the dark powers, tortured and mutilated, ruined and terrible form of life, and now perfected. My fighting Uruk-hai.
You see, the reason why attempting to make the orcs sympathetic in the Rings of Power series didn't work is because that's not what orcs are meant to be. Orcs are not sympathetic creatures. They are distorted, zombified elves and men. Tortured, mutilated, and all that horrendous stuff to the point where any trace of their soul is gone, and what's left is this zombified husk that does all these monstrous deeds for Sauron. Tolkien orcs are not the kind of sympathetic creatures you'd see in World of Warcraft. Those are entirely different lores that people seem to confuse with one another. The main inspiration for orcs were mainly that of demons. Orcs represent moral darkness, not biological darkness. Orcs represent corruption of character, not the amount of melanin on your skin. These morons have completely overlooked the fact that Azog the Pale Orc exists, arguably the most ferocious and mean orc there is. And Azog is indeed mentioned in the Hobbit book. So logically, given that there exists both pale and very dark orcs, it's very clear as daylight that orcs are not meant to represent one definitive skin color. They represent corruption of character. So there you go. I've managed to successfully debunk the two biggest accusations against Tolkien. And what I've said is backed up by several Tolkien scholars as well as some letters on Tolkien's end. Because another accusation made against Tolkien was that he was some kind of Nazi supporter, but his personal letters proves otherwise. Tolkien was very positive towards the Jewish people and was highly critical of the unscientific views of the Nazis. So again, these accusations are completely fallacious and are based on assumptions, not facts. Another accusation is that Tolkien doesn't have enough representation in Middle-earth. Look, let me put this bluntly. Tolkien wrote his Legendarium series during a time when people were not so fixated on racial politics as they are today. Tolkien was noticing that many cultures had their own respective mythos, but England didn't have its own mythos, so he decided to create one. Now, I've read somewhere that the Chinese mythos of Wukong, for example, that kind of story is filled to the brim with Chinese characters, and you'll hardly get any, if not anybody else, who hails from anyone outside of China. Because contrary to what a lot of people will try to say today, in the past, people didn't get the chance to branch out in the same way they do today. So it's historically unreliable to claim that history was filled to the brim with cultures that were as diverse as downtown Miami. That is unrealistic. Sure, that would be more true of today, but that's not really true of the past. The past involved people, whether they knew it or not, getting to the point where we are today. So how can you acknowledge the values of today if you don't acknowledge what built up to that until that point? How do we know about properly confronting the problems of today if we don't understand the foundations of the past? I say this because Tolkien, in the same way that these Chinese people were focused on telling their own Chinese mythos, Tolkien was focusing on making an English mythos, or more of a European mythos to be more exact. He took a lot of inspiration from several diverse cultures within Europe. He took inspiration from German mythos for the dwarves, inspiration from Anglo-Saxon mythos especially, which is made very clear throughout the stories. And that kind of diversity within Europe is portrayed within Tolkien's Legendarium. So whilst you don't really get diversity of cultures in the sense that, oh, here's a definitive representation of South America, here's a definitive representation of Japan. Instead, what you get are representations of character. You get the elves, who are graceful and lovers of nature. You get the dwarves, who are tough and resourceful and very crafty with the way they create their jewelry. You get the hobbits, who are homely people, who value the simple things in life. You have men, who are the most ambitious of all the different species presented in Tolkien's Legendarium. And of course, there's all the Ents, the Eagles, and yeah, so on and so forth. What a lot of people today don't realize is that people's characters go beyond their skin color. Character is what defines a person. And it seems so odd for the woke crowd to judge everybody by the color of their skin. And I can't think of anybody who tried to say orcs are Africans prior to the woke crowd bringing it up. So if the woke crowd brought it up for the sake of virtue signaling, which they do all the time, then logically, the woke people are the racist ones. The woke people are the ones comparing orcs to Africans, and that's one of the most outrageously racist things I've ever heard. Making these assumptions based on skin color. That's racism! That's racist! You judge characters by the color of their skin. That is racism! So logically, they think, oh duh, orcs have dark skin. That must mean they're Africans. That's racist! That accusation is racist. Duh, but racism can only come from white people. Liar! Now, there is another fact of European culture that the woke crowd seem to deliberately overlook, and that is the fact that Europeans, in collaboration with Africans, helped to stop the transatlantic slave trade. Specifically, Christian men from Europe, William Wilberforce, Thomas Clarkson, Granville Sharp, in collaboration with Olaudah Equiano, who was a former slave, as well as in collaboration with former slave captain turned priest John Newton, they all collaborated together to end the transatlantic slave trade, but the woke crowd seem to overlook that. They won't shut up about the fact that Africans were enslaved, and yet they don't celebrate the fact that Europeans helped to end the slave trade. That seems like a silly double standard to me. So there's this university course that is trying to push this propaganda. I thought universities were meant to teach you how to think, not what to think. If they really were being fair in the way they were educating students, surely they would teach students various sides on differing topics, rather than trying to shove one particular side that doesn't adhere to the truth. Then again, I guess if they were telling the truth, that would completely destroy their agenda, right? And also, if Tolkien's Legendarium is as racist as these politically driven woke morons claim it is, then why do people who are, in their terms, culturally diverse enjoy Tolkien's Legendarium? Why do people like my friend Malika Wrights, whose lineage is from Cameroon, Africa, why do people like her enjoy Tolkien's Legendarium? I'm waiting for a consistent answer. So, needless to say, the woke crowd need to start judging people more for their character and not only by the color of their skin. Boy, this video's gonna get a lot of views. Were there any facts that I've overlooked? Let me know in the comments down below. Although, I wouldn't be surprised if there were people who were trying to defend the very ideas that I've already debunked in this video. Side note, Tolkien has explicitly stated that he doesn't like allegory. And the woke crowd keep seeing all forms of fiction as allegory to suit their distorted double standard lens.
People do not fully understand the difference between an allegory and an application. You can go to a Shakespeare play and you can apply it to things in your mind if you like, but they're not allegories. At least most of them are not. There's more allegorical elements, for instance, in the Tempest than the most, But certainly, I mean, many people apply to nuclear, the ring, particularly the nuclear bomb, don't they? I think that was in my mind, is that the whole thing is only an allegory of it. Well, it isn't.
In other words, if you're going to view Tolkien's work through any kind of allegorical lens, You're already interpreting Tolkien's work in the wrong way. Just know that I have no ill intent towards anybody in the comments, and if anyone tries to say, you're wrong, you're in the blah 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 blah, look, don't show mercy on them, okay? Don't stoop down to their level of mindless rage, okay? Let's be civil here. Let's live by example. In the meantime, thank you all so much for watching, and until next time, Scott's Thinker signing out.